Alright guys, in this video I'm going to talk about feeding. The most common question that I get about feeding has to do with how much do I feed my gecko. I don't know if I'm feeding it too much, not enough, so that's what I'm going to address. Just to make it interesting, I've got one of my little bayonets here in the video, and one obvious thing about feeding an animal is it is dependent on size, and so this is a little guy. He's only about 25 grams, so he's not going to eat very much. But what I'm going to show you is a method that I use so that I don't waste food, I don't overfeed, underfeed, and this is something you can use no matter how big the gecko is, how small. If you got 100 geckos, if you've got one, it doesn't matter. You can use this method. And really all you need some kind of feeding dishes, and these are some dishes that I use. I use jar lids like from peanut butter or from, Gatorade or whatever, because that's cheap, it's affordable. You can wash these. I do. The Crested Gecko diet is really easy to wash out. Just take you some water, and I actually use a toothbrush and get all the gunk out, and it doesn't take 30 seconds to clean one of these. And then you need some kind of scoop. Now, I don't use the one I actually use is this one, but you can use any different size. The main thing is you want to be consistent. So if you're using a regular spoon, if you're using half a teaspoon, quarter teaspoon, whatever, it doesn't matter. You just want to always use the same spoon. So this is the one that I use. And I make up a big thing of Crested Gecko diet. And I get all my dishes out, and I know how many spoonfuls of these I feed to each gecko. Now, how do I know that? Well, I'll show you. These are 4 bowls that I just pulled out of some cages last night that I used to feed some animals last night. And I can tell by looking at each of these bowls what's going on as far as how much I'm feeding them. So, for example, I put 2 scoops of this in this bowl last night. And when I got up today, this is how much is left. So this tells me that I'm feeding this gecko too much. You don't want to give them too much food. They're not going to overeat. The reality is they're going to eat until they're full, and you're going to feed them 3 times a week. I do like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, whatever. Any food that you give them that's extra is just going to be wasted like this. If I leave this in the cage, it's just going to mold and dry up and get all nasty, and they're not going to eat it, so this is a waste of food. So since I put 2 scoops in here, this is rocket science. When I feed them later this week, I'm going to put 1.5 in there. It's that simple. Now, if you want to write that down somewhere, if you want to write it like on top of a cage or something where you keep that animal, or keep a notebook or whatever, that's fine. And as that animal grows, it might start to eat more. So if a couple months down the road, I start to notice that with 1.5 scoops, the bowl starts to look like this, this is an indication I'm not feeding this animal enough. Notice it's eaten pretty much everything. There's a few little specks in there. So this is an animal that's actually grown quite a bit for me over the last few months. So I actually need to start feeding it more. And I've been feeding it just 1 scoop of this. So now I'm going to go up to 1.5 scoops. And it'll probably start looking somewhat like this. But that animal's going to start eating all of that. This right here I would also say is one where I'm not feeding it enough. And so these are 2 examples where I would need to start feeding him more. What I really like to see is a bowl that looks like this. This right here tells me that I'm feeding this animal pretty much just right. You want to have just a little bit left in the bottom. That's an indication that the animal has got enough food, that it can feed itself and get full, and there's still a little bit left over, but you obviously don't want a ton of waste. So what I'm going to be doing here, this one I'll cut back on how much I'm feeding it. These 2 here, these animals, I'll start feeding them a little bit more, and that way they settle into a nice rhythm as far as how much they're eating. And that's really the best way to know, am I feeding the animal too much, am I feeding it too little? Again, that all goes back to record keeping. It's very important that you know how much you're feeding your animals. It's very important that when you mix your Crested Gecko diet, you do it the exact same way every time. And then it's also important that, like in another video I showed where I talked about record keeping with weights and things, it's very important that you do that as well, because if you are seeing bowls that consistently look like this and you're seeing consistent growth with your animals, then that tells you you're feeding that animal as much as you need. If you're seeing bowls that consistently look like this and you're not seeing as much growth with that animal, then that tells you that you obviously need to start giving that animal a little bit of extra food and so forth. So I hope that that's been helpful. This is the method that I use for feeding all my animals. It's the way I've always done it. I've never had any problems. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important record keeping is. Isn't that right, Hazel? Record keeping is very important. Those are her Christmas jammies. So, keep records. Moral of the story. Tell him, buddy. Tell him keep records.